Okay, now we're going to explain 5 concepts. Threshold, that applies to all of the other concepts. Fill quantity, bearing area, peak volume, and last, the bearing curve. Threshold is an artificial measurement of the depth of the sample above a certain level. That's considered in all the calculations. We're working with a representative peak here. You have a height from the base to the top of the peak. And the threshold is simply at 0 initially, but you can arbitrarily change it. In other words, by representing the green ring here, you can raise the threshold by 5 mils. It's arbitrary. You can make it whatever you want. We're adding another ring here, so this makes the threshold, say, 10 mils. It's completely arbitrary. We can change it however we want to, and believe me, we changed it about 500,000 times. When you set a threshold, though, you get the first thing that we thought was interesting and would be a correlation to direct shear, and that's fill quantity. Fill quantity is the volume it takes to raise the area or raise the volume to a certain threshold. In other words, represented by the volume of these 2 rings here. Again, over a 6 by 6 inch sample. We thought it was really cool in a kind of geo-geek sort of way. But it didn't really correlate very well to direct shear, so we were disappointed. So we gave up on the volume idea, only temporarily though, and started to look at area. Another thing that you know about your samples is the bearing area of the peaks. Again, represented by this individual peak, but you know it for all 6 by 6 inch samples. You know the area of the peak, what its square area is, and we thought, okay, this will be a good correlation to direct shear. Again, you can set a threshold however you want, and we looked at a bunch of different thresholds. But once again, we were disappointed because bearing area doesn't correlate very well to direct shear. So we gave up on the area idea and went back to volume. We looked at our peaks, again with an arbitrary threshold, and said, okay, let's look at peak volume. This is the 3-dimensional representation, including the interior of the peak. It's the cubic volume of all the peaks. Again, not just the one peak here, but we're looking at the 6 by 6 inch sample. Peak volume was pretty exciting. It seemed to correlate well with direct shear, but we found something that was even better, and that is bearing curve. Bearing curve is very similar to peak volume, but there are 2 differences. Over time, bearing curve has been developed in other industries because some portions of the peak don't contribute as strongly as others. For example, the top portions of the peak, they're not as valuable. During a direct shear test, the top portion tends to get sheared off. Also, the base of the peak tends to not get an strong interface with the soils, so that tends to not work as well either. So we were very excited because the bearing curve seemed to correlate very well with direct shear. So now hopefully you understand what I'm talking about, so let's go look at the graphs.